Welcome to the How to Be Awesome at Your Job podcast.
All of us are supercommunicators at various times. We all sometimes walk into the meeting and we know exactly the right thing to say, or a friend calls and they're upset and we know exactly how to make them feel better. If we learn the skills, then we can do it whenever we want. Unless we know how to look for what's happening in a conversation, we can totally miss what they need, and they can miss what we're asking them for.
That's Charles Duhigg. He's a super smart dude winning awards, including the Pulitzer Prize and those from the National Academies of Sciences. He's authored best-selling books, including The Power of Habit, Smarter, Better, Faster, and most recently, Supercommunicators. Today, he's unmasking the language of supercommunicators to help us more powerfully and more consistently connect with others. So you'll learn 1, what supercommunicators know that others don't. 2, how to ask questions that deepen and enrich relationships. And 3, how one sentence can dramatically ease workplace conflict. I'm Pete Makaitis. This is How to Be Awesome at Your Job. And now, here's Charles. Charles, welcome to How to Be Awesome at Your Job.
Thanks for having me on. I appreciate it.
Well, I'm excited to be chatting. I read your prior book, The Power of Habit, many years ago. You got a fresh one, Supercommunicators, coming out here. I can't wait to dig into your wisdom, but first I got to hear. So in addition to being a Pulitzer Prize winning investigative journalist and graduating from impressive places, you've also served as bike messenger. Tell us this tale.
Yeah. So before I went to business school, I was living in San Francisco and didn't have a real job. And so I was like, you know what I could do? I could become a bike messenger. And this is back in the late 90s when like bike messengers were super cool. And so I signed up for it and I lasted literally one day. I actually got pneumonia from being a bike messenger for one day because San Francisco, of course, is filled with hills. And I was not physically ready to like be a bike messenger.
Yeah.
It was interesting though, because I mean, I did spend time with the other bike messengers and probably about half of them were like active drug users and like had like some real serious like health issues going on. And I do remember there was this one guy, I took the bus over with him in the morning. And we were driving over the bridge on the way into San Francisco past the IKEA. And someone's like, I hate IKEA. IKEA's corporate awfulness. And he's like, no, bro, IKEA's the best. They got that play area for kids. Me and the wife, sometimes we'll just bring our daughter there. And then we just take off for like 6 or 7 hours, man. It's amazing. And I was like, okay, this is bike messenger life. Like,
bike messenger life. Well, I'm thinking you have to be in great shape if they're using drugs. Which drugs are we talking about?
I don't know. I did not really ask. There seemed to be a lot of conversation about like various drugs, which of course I knew nothing about. No, they're in great shape.
Totally.
Like if you ride your bike all day long all over San Francisco, you're in pretty good shape. The other thing is that I just didn't know how to like navigate San Francisco. And it's a hard city. There's ways around the hills and I knew zero of them.
All right. Well, you live to tell the tale, and I would be most terrified of getting hit by cars.
Yes. No, I was terrified of a lot of things.
Yeah.
That was definitely one of them.
But if you got the cool bag, the bike messenger bags are the coolest. They're like with the seatbelt buckle, you know, and that material.
Oh, and at the end of that one day that I spent as a bike messenger, when I was like on the BART coming home, I felt like the coolest thing on earth. I was like, yeah, I'm a bike messenger. You know, just like messaging stuff. And then I got pneumonia.
Mercy. Well, I'm glad you've recovered. And I'm glad we're here now chatting about supercommunicators. It's a great title and a great premise. And you were something of a supercommunicator in your world. Although I think you'll tell us times that maybe that was not as much the case. But before we get into all that, can you maybe kick us off with anything particularly startling or surprising that you discovered as you were researching and putting this together?
Yeah, no, absolutely. This has really changed how I communicate. And you mentioned that I'm a super communicator. Actually, the truth is all of us are super communicators at various times. We all sometimes walk into the meeting and we know exactly the right thing to say, or a friend calls and they're upset and we know exactly how to make them feel better. And the point is that actually, we all have this talent set. In fact, it's actually hardwired into our brains. It's how we evolved. But sometimes we can forget it. And so the goal of this book is actually to remind people, or teach them how to think about communication so that it's easier to remember what to do to be a super communicator. And for me, this really like started when I was talking to these marriage therapists, and one of them described a situation that I've had a lot in my own life, which is sometimes I would come home from work after like a long and hard day, And I would start complaining to my wife. I'd be like, my boss is a jerk and my coworkers don't appreciate me and blah, blah, blah. And my wife very, very wisely would offer some practical advice. She'd say something like, why don't you take your boss out to lunch and you guys can get to know each other better? And instead of hearing what she was saying, I, of course, would like explode and be like, why aren't you supporting me? I want you to I want you to be outraged on my behalf. And so when I was talking to these therapists, I was like, what is going on here? Like, why? We're both bringing sort of our best selves to this conversation. We're both bringing good intentions. And they said, look, and this is the big insight at the core of the book. They said, look, most of us think about discussions as just being one thing, right? It's a discussion about one topic, but that's totally wrong. Every discussion is actually made up of multiple kinds of conversations. And in particular, there's these three buckets that most conversations fall into. There are practical conversations, right? Why don't you take your boss out to lunch? Here's a problem. Let's solve it. We need to make a plan for how we're going to get to my mom's for vacation. Then there are emotional conversations. And in an emotional conversation, I do not want you to solve my problem. I want you literally just to kind of give me encouragement and validate how I'm feeling. And then finally, there's also social conversations. And social conversations are about how we relate to each other, how other people see us, how sort of we exist within society. And oftentimes, when we're having a conversation, we will move, or having a discussion, we'll move from conversation to conversation, right? But if we're not having the same kind of conversation at the same moment, we really won't be able to connect.
We mean like party A and party B, both on the same page, the same style of the conversation.
Exactly.
Okay.
Exactly. When I came home and I was upset, I was having an emotional conversation, and my wife replied with a practical conversation. And so I could not hear what she was saying, and she got frustrated by what I was saying because we weren't, what's known within psychology as the matching principle. We weren't having the same kind of conversation at the same moment.
Understood. And you say to complexify, often the conversation is not just one, it's multiples, sort of simultaneously or weaving back and forth or all those things.
Yeah, no, absolutely. You're usually moving from emotional conversation to practical conversation to social conversation and then back to emotional. And what's important is just that everyone who's in that conversation, whether it's two people or many people, that we look for the clues about what kind of conversation is happening, and we match others and we invite them to match us. So when someone says something really emotional, they're sending us a signal that look, we need to talk about how we feel. This isn't about solving the problem. This is about airing out why the problem exists. Our ability to pick up on that and then match them. And then after that, invite them to move to solutions, to move to a practical conversation. That's really powerful, right? That's how you connect with really anyone.
Certainly. Oh, well, that sounds powerful. I suppose, if I may be so bold, can you prove it? Can you tell me really what's at stake or what's unlocked if we upgrade our super communication frequency from once in a while when I'm on fire to fairly regularly?
Oh, I mean, it's hugely powerful, right? Think about at work, how many conversations you have that if the conversation goes well, things get so much better. And if the conversation does not go well, things don't get better. Let me ask you. So just think about the last week. What's the most meaningful conversation you had in the last week?
Well, I'm in the process of buying a company. So we had a meeting with buyer-seller accountants. So I think that seemed important from just a dollars and cents perspective.
Totally. That seems really meaningful. I mean, and I'm sure that's taking up a bunch. Now, my guess is that a lot of those conversations are practical, but buying a company is also brings up a lot of emotions, right? It can be scary. It can be exciting. You can have partners who are saying I think we're moving too fast or we're not moving fast enough. A big transaction like that, have you found that some of the conversations you've had with your spouse or with your partners or anyone else, that they've been emotional instead of just purely practical?
They have been emotional in that you see emotions are there, but it hasn't been super intensely emotional in either way. Well, maybe between my partner and I are oh, wow, this would be such a cool opportunity if we did this or this or this or this or this, this would unlock this. So there's that, but never have we been super intensely emotional in terms of angry or you're screwing me over, which is great. Neither one of us feel that.
No, which is great. And by the way, most emotional conversations are not super, super emotional. They're not super intense, right? I mean, we all have those conversations sometimes, and knowing how to navigate them is really important. But most of the conversations we have every day are at a lower temperature. And that's fantastic. But if your business partner came and he was like, I'm so excited, this is going to be amazing. And you were like, you didn't engage with that excitement at all. You didn't sort of invite him to share that excitement. It'd be hard going forward, right? And then if you came in super practical minded and you're like, look, I don't care how excited you are, like, we got to figure out the dollars and cents on this. And all he talked about was like the excitement and how he feels, it'd be super frustrating for you.
Certainly.
But just helping us recognize what kind of conversation is happening, that helps us figure out how to communicate.
It does. And what's intriguing, though, is the interconnectedness. Like, let's say, I'm super excited about this specific possibility of integrating some staff here over there. And they go, oh. And so then, in some ways, the optimal response is, for me, at least in that moment, is not so much, yeah, that's really cool. Although that's not bad. I mean, I wouldn't shun that. I'll take it. But I think for me, I guess maybe next level stuff is hitting both. Just like, oh my gosh, that is really exciting. And it'd be so easy to just do this. It's sort of like we hit the emotion and extended the practical at the same time.
The book is filled with stories of sort of super communicators who are just normal people who sort of figure something out about a particular conversation they're in. One of them is about this CIA officer who he's in his early 30s. He's just been hired. And his job is to go recruit spies overseas. So they send him to Europe and they're like, come back with some spies. And this guy, his name's Jim Lawler. He's a great guy. He spends like a year trying and just like strikes out again and again and again. And like he is terrible at this job. He can't make a real connection with anyone he's trying to recruit. And then he meets this woman, Yasmin, who she's in town. She works in the foreign ministry in her home country in the Middle East. She's like the perfect candidate. And he goes and he bumps into her at lunch and then invites her to lunch the next day, tells her he's an oil speculator. And eventually they get to know each other and they kind of start investing in each other a little bit. And then at one point he's like, look, I lied to you. I'm not an oil speculator. I work for the Central Intelligence Agency. Will you help us by telling us what's going on inside your ministry? Because we want the same things you do. We want to stop the repression of women. We want to bring down this theocracy that's ruling your country. And she just looks at him and starts crying. And she's like, they kill people for that. And she just bolts out. And so this guy, Jim Lawler, he's told his bosses already that he's recruiting Yasmin. And when he goes and he tells them, like, I tried to close the deal and she ran away, his boss is like, you're going to get fired. You've been here a year. She's your only possible recruitment. And you just screwed it up. So Lawler knows that he has one more opportunity, one more meal that he can ask Yasmin to have with him. And so he takes her to the meal and she's really depressed. And she's depressed because she's about to go back to her home country. And she's kind of depressed in herself. She's depressed that she hasn't changed more on this vacation. And he tries to cheer her up, right? He tries to like tell her stories about when they were sightseeing and it just doesn't work. And then towards the end of the meal, he just decides like, you know what, like this isn't going to happen. I've screwed this up. And so he just gets honest with Yasmin and he says like, look, I know that you're like disappointed in yourself. I'm super disappointed in myself. Like I thought I was going to be a great CIA officer and it turns out I'm terrible at this. And I see other guys who got hired with me and women who get hired with me and they're doing so much better. They have like this confidence I don't have. And he just starts talking about like how he's going to have to go back to Texas and work for his dad and his brother's like a better salesman than he is. And while he's describing all this, just being as honest as he can and matching Yasmin unintentionally, she was glum and wanted to talk about how she felt. And now finally, he is also talking about how he feels. She starts crying. And Lawler reaches across the table to say, like, I didn't mean to make you cry. And she goes, no, what you want is important. We can do this together. And she becomes one of the best assets in the Middle East over the next 30 years. And Lawler actually goes on to be one of the top recruiters in the CIA. But I think the point here is that unless we know how to look for what's happening in a conversation, unless we are a little bit conscious, and it's not hard to get conscious of this, a little bit conscious about how to match someone, we can totally miss what they need and they can miss what we're asking them for.
Well, yes, thank you. That's a lovely tale. And so let's just go ahead and do more, please, Charles. So that's a demonstration of the emotional vibe, like what's up. And so in that instance, there's crying. There is some dramatics. But so give us more of a tale showing how that unfolds marvelously in the practical flavor and the social flavor.
Well, okay. And I would actually say that conversation, there are emotional aspects, but there's also practical aspects, right? Because she's agreeing to become a spy for him. So one of the things that we know is that when researchers have looked at people who are consistently super communicators, they found that these kinds of people on average ask 10 to 20 times as many questions as other people. But we're oftentimes not aware of it because the questions are like, hey, that's interesting. What do you think about that? Or like, what'd you do next? Or just little things that make it easier for us to enter a conversation. And there's actually an experiment I like to do. So think for a second. If you were having like a really bad day, like just a terrible day, who would you call that you know would make you feel better?
Oh, we got a few options.
Sure. But I don't know. Who comes to mind first?
Oh, we could say my wife.
Okay. Now, let me ask you this. Is your wife like the funniest person you know? Like stand-up comedian, funny, like just like kills it every time?
She is among the funniest people I know. Yes.
Okay. But you described her as a wife. You don't describe her as like my comedian wife. What about, is she the most successful person you know? Like earns the most money? Yeah.
From an income generation perspective, she is not.
Okay. And what's interesting is the audience probably thought of someone that they telephone to make them feel better. And that person probably is not their funniest friend or their smartest friend or their most successful friend. So why telephone that person? What's that person doing that makes us feel so good? And the answer is what they're doing is they are inviting us to share who we are, and then they're proving to us that they are listening. So you asked for an example of like how this happens in the everyday world. There's a guy named Nicholas Epley, who's a professor at the University of Chicago. And one of the things that he's done a lot of work on is trying to figure out what kinds of questions can we ask that make people feel closer to each other, almost like without it being obvious. And what he found is that there's this category of question known as a deep question. And what a deep question is it something that asks you about your values or your beliefs or your past experiences in a way that invites you to open up and explain who you are. An example of this is like to say to someone, where do you work? And then they say, I'm a lawyer. To say, oh, have you always wanted to be a lawyer? Do you love practicing the law? Those are deep questions. Now, they don't seem like overly intrusive or awkward, but they're deep questions because they invite the other person to expose something a little bit that's vulnerable. And if when we hear that vulnerability, if we reciprocate that vulnerability, that other person will feel closer to us. So my guess is that a lot of the conversations you have with your wife, and tell me if I'm getting this wrong, involve you asking her the deeper question rather than the surface question, her telling you something that's real, and then you responding with something real yourself, and that you probably feel closer as a result. Is that fair?
Oh, yeah, sure, that happens.
Yeah. But we don't think about asking deep questions, and yet it's something that we know helps us figure out what the other person wants to talk about and helps us align.
So let's hear some more examples of these deep questions. So have you always wanted to be a lawyer? Do you love practicing law? What are some other examples here?
Really? I mean, anything. Where did you grow up?
Danville, Illinois.
Okay. What was the best part of growing up there?
Well, what's deep is that I have to think for a while. There's a lot of good things.
That's a good sign, though.
It's so funny. Like when I hear questions, I really like to answer them masterfully or accurately. And so, but in some ways, I could say any great thing about growing up at Danville. So I'll say that I just had a lot of fun meeting so many different folks. And it's almost like, in my experience, divisions of race or class or whatever didn't even matter. It was just like, oh, wow, Rohini's parents have a huge house. That's kind of cool.
Yeah.
And that's that. And then on to the next. And it doesn't matter.
Here's what's interesting about the answer you just gave me, right?
Yeah.
First of all, you're telling me a little bit about what it was like to grow up in this place, right? And so you're telling me about your experiences. You're also telling me about your values. You value people who are kind. You value kindness. It sounds like you value kindness more than financial success or professional success. It sounds like you've had some experiences where like you've had friends who are more wealthy than you and probably friends who were less wealthy than you, but that you found something really meaningful in creating friendships that aren't defined by demographic lines. That's a pretty easy question for me to ask, right? Like, what's your favorite part of growing up there? And yet, when you answer that question, I now know so much more about you. And you've also told me something kind of intimate. Now, in the language of psychology, you've exposed a vulnerability, right? You've put me in a place where I can judge you. You might not care what my judgment is, and you probably don't. Like if I was like, oh man, that sounds like a terrible place to grow up, you wouldn't care because I'm some idiot that you just met, right? But the fact that you opened yourself up for and exposed a little bit of vulnerability means that you're ready to feel closer to me. And if I reciprocate with vulnerability, if I tell you that I grew up in New Mexico, Albuquerque, which is true, I'm going there next pretty soon. And one of the things that I loved most about it was that my high school was 89% Hispanic or Native American. And that's true of a lot of New Mexico. And like to grow up as a white guy, to get a chance to feel like a minority is really powerful, and it creates empathy. A, I've told you something about myself by answering the question that I asked you, but B, by reciprocating your vulnerability, we feel closer to each other. We can't help but feel closer to each other. Literally, our brains are hardwired to feel closer to each other.
Yeah. And what's interesting is, as we super communicate with each other, is that it's funny how the monkey mind just has all these associations and like where it might just naturally want to go. So you say Albuquerque, I'm thinking, I love the show Breaking Bad. And so I have a desire to say something about Breaking Bad. But really, from a connecting perspective, that doesn't really do much for us here.
Okay, so here's a good example. So I said I'm from Albuquerque. You definitely could have broken in and been like, oh my God, I love Breaking Bad. That's the best show ever. But because you are a good communicator, you intuited like that would actually disrupt the flow of this conversation. Like that's a fun conversation, maybe a practical conversation, and I'm revealing something about who I am. It's an emotional conversation or a social conversation. And so instead of interrupting me and stealing the spotlight and saying like, man, I love Breaking Bad. Like, do you like Breaking Bad? You knew to match the kind of conversation I was having. Now, think of how many times we sometimes get this wrong, right? I get this wrong with my kids all the time. Like my kids come to me with something they want to talk about. They're upset about something, or they want to talk about social, like the social scene at their school. And instead of listening and asking questions and matching them and meeting them where they are, I start trying to solve their problems. I have like all these lessons in my head that I want to like shove into their head. And of course they're like, whatever, Dad. It's like you breaking in and being like, I love Breaking Bad. It's like me being like, well, here's a lesson that you can learn. I do this all the time. I still make this mistake. But the more we become conscious of it, the more that we're aware of listening for what kind of conversation is happening, matching other people, inviting them to match us, the more we end up having those special moments.
Well, and it's funny, I think if we weren't primed in the world of thinking about deep questions and matching and practical versus emotional versus social, I might very well have just let her rip with Breaking Bad is awesome.
Yeah. Or I might have like talked about like growing up in Albuquerque. I mean, this is something that definitely happens, right? Someone says like, my dad passed away about 5 years ago and I was living in New York at the time. When I came back to New York after the funeral, it's the most interesting thing that had happened to me that year, right? It's sad and it's hard, but it's also like just interesting and complicated. And like one of two things would happen. I would tell people that I was just back from my dad's funeral and they would say, I'm sorry, and then change the topic. And they'd usually change it to something that's totally unrelated or a totally different emotional attitude. Or they would just not respond. Like that happened all the time. And what I really wanted is I wanted people to be like, what was it like? Like, what was your dad like? Tell me about your dad. That's amazing. When someone's passed away and someone else asks you what they're like, you love describing them. And I think that to your point, oftentimes during the most meaningful conversations, we have this instinct to do that. Hey, Breaking Bad, I love Breaking Bad. Because we feel so uncertain. We feel so unsure of ourselves in the conversation. But the more that we can recognize what the conversation, how the conversation works, what this other person is asking for, the more certain and comfortable we become in giving it to them. And that can be incredibly powerful.
It is. And I think there's uncertainty or fear or trepidation, whatever the vibe is in that moment. It's like the stakes, the risk is really, I think, lower than what we perceive it to be emotionally.
Oh, absolutely.
Because if I were to say, oh man, I'm sorry, that must have been really hard. Tell me, what are some of your favorite memories of your dad that came to mind? I mean, I think like at worst, you might say, I really just not comfortable telling you about that.
Yeah.
I mean, you're not going to like scream at me or assault me. You might just shut that down if it's like, dude, I barely know you. I don't feel like crying in front of you at this moment. It's been a day. I'm just going to terminate the conversation.
And by the way, it's been 5 years. And so like when I bump into other people who've been to a funeral, I ask them like, tell me a little bit about your dad or your mom. Literally not once has someone ever said, I don't feel like talking about it right now.
All right.
People love talking about it. It's like literally this thing that just happened to them. It would be like if you got married and none of your friends asked you about the wedding. When you get married, you want to talk about the wedding. It was overwhelming.
Yeah.
And honestly, like going to a funeral for a parent is just as overwhelming and sad instead of happy, but you still want to talk about it. And I think that you're right. I think that people perceive a risk that not only is overblown, oftentimes it actually isn't even there.
That's good. Well, so then social who are we? This category, it sounds like we've touched upon it in terms of its unveiling values and what we're about.
It's a little bit different. So when we're having a social conversation, what we're really talking about is how do I relate to other people? How do they relate to me? How do I see other people? How do I think other people see me? So think about, for instance, there's a story in the book about Netflix. So Netflix had an executive who about 5 years ago, he used the N-word in a meeting. And he used it in a kind of benign way. He was trying to describe something, but many people in the meeting, for good reason, were offended. He ended up getting fired because of this. But it set off this whole controversy within Netflix. And they hired someone to come in who was a super communicator, understood how communication works. And her name is Vernee Myers. She's amazing. She kind of transformed how the conversation across the entire company, right? Thousands and thousands of people. She transformed how the conversation is happening to help people understand it is okay to say to someone, I see something differently than you because of my background. And that doesn't mean either of us are wrong or right? If I'm a Black parent, I might very well see cops differently than a white parent. And that doesn't necessarily mean like I'm wrong or I'm right. It also doesn't mean we have to agree with each other. But understanding that difference, that's a social conversation. It's a conversation about identities and how identities shape how we see things. That's actually a huge part of understanding. And if we're comfortable having that conversation, then it makes it a lot easier to come together. Secondarily, as part of that conversation is this emphasis on belonging, right? That every single person has the right to participate in a social conversation and to have an identity, right? Everyone has had a racial experience, a gender experience, whether you're Black or white or man or female or non-binary. We all have these experiences that shape who we are. And sharing that with other people, it feels really good. That's a social conversation. A social conversation is sharing how we see ourselves in an attempt to align how others see us with our self-image and to hear how they see themselves and how that might differ from how we see them.
Can you give us some more examples here?
Yeah, well, so a lot of social conversations are like office gossip, right? Like think about, there's actually these really interesting studies on gossip. And what they find is that gossip is really important within companies because gossip is how we not only learn information, it's how we establish moral and social norms without having to be overbearing about it, right? So if someone's like, oh my God, like Jim got so drunk at that party last night and they seem critical of it, then we know like actually drunkenness is not a norm that's accepted at this company. And it gets even down to smaller things. And once you start thinking about these kinds of conversations and the powerful role that they play, you can begin thinking about how to make them better. So there was a study that was done of an investment bank. And this investment bank was like a place where like people were at each other's throats all day long. Like they were competing for deals. They were competing for bonuses. They would have these like screaming fights on a regular basis during meetings. So these researchers come in and they tell everyone, okay, look, before every meeting for the next week, what we want you to do is we're going to give you some note cards. Before every meeting, just write down literally one sentence on the note card and write down what you hope to accomplish in this meeting, your goal, and what kind of tone or mood you hope the meeting will have. And then when you start the meeting, if you want, you can read it, you can share it with other people, or you don't have to. Most people didn't. And what they found is that when they looked at the cards people wrote, what people would write were things like, I want to ask Maria if she wants to come on vacation with me, but I want to make it easy for her to say no. Or I want us to figure out the budget for next year, right? Pretty practical conversation. But I want everyone to get everything off their chest because there's been some tension. Just by asking people to write that sentence before each meeting, the incidence of conflict went down 80% within the firm that week. Now, that did not mean that people agreed with each other. It did not mean that they stopped fighting. It did not mean that they were less competitive. But because everyone knew what they wanted out of that meeting, and because they knew what kind of mood they were looking for, they were able to signal that much more easily to other people. And we pick up on those signals, right?
Yeah, well, that's my favorite kind of thing, Charles. We have a minor intervention with a huge result. That's cool. So we're writing that down. And in so doing, that gets to the who are we in terms of, I guess, who are we in that moment in terms of how we're showing up right then and there.
Yeah, absolutely. That we're coming together and we're working for this firm together. We are all here trying to remind ourselves that we are on the same team as opposed to on different teams. And if I'm talking to you in a meeting and I'm saying I want to discuss the budget, but I want to give everyone a chance to get things off their chest, then what I'm saying to the other people is, I understand you are frustrated. I'm your boss. I could tell you we're just going to do the budget. It's my way or the highway. But I'm signaling to you, in a social context, I understand you are frustrated. I understand that you don't feel like I am being the boss I ought to be right now. And once we have that conversation out in the open, then we can start talking about how do we resolve it? Are there things about how we run the social organization that is this company, that we run it in ways that make it hard for people to speak up or to bring their best selves to work? If we're having conversations with someone else and we're talking about, I have a problem, here's my solution, that's a practical conversation. Now let's think about how the rest of the firm is going to react when I bring up this solution. That's a social conversation. Because the way that other people react will not be based entirely on pragmatics and practicality. It won't be based entirely on emotions. It might be based on power differentials or on structural issues. But once we sit down and we're look, let's talk about how this is going to play out at the company from a social perspective, then suddenly we're having a slightly different conversation than an emotional conversation or a practical conversation. We're trying to anticipate how other people see themselves and how that shapes what they believe.
Beautiful. Thank you. So tell me, Charles, is there anything else you want to make sure to mention before we shift gears and hear about some of your favorite things?
No, I mean, the thing I would say is the book is filled with stories, right? And the reason why it's filled with stories, there's this awesome study called the 36 Questions That Lead to Love. It's known as the Fast Friends Procedure. And it was a study to try and make strangers into friends. And it worked. It worked by getting them to ask each other deep questions. There's stories about conflict. What do we do when we're in conflict with someone? And the answer there, and it's about, that story takes place in part online on Facebook. It's this group that was put together of gun rights advocates and gun control advocates. And what we found is that in conflict, it's even more important to prove that we're listening. And one of the ways we can prove that we're listening is by this thing called looping for understanding, which is, it's pretty instinctual, right? It's ask someone a question, repeat back to them what they just told you in your own words. And then the third step, and this is the step most people forget, but it's most important, ask them if you got it right. If you do that and you continue looping until they agree that you have gotten it right, it's almost impossible for people to be angry at each other, no matter how big their difference is. And that doesn't mean that you have to agree with each other, but it means you can take anger out of the equation. And so my goal with these stories is, and there's a lot of practical tips, right? There's sort of the bullet points after each chapter, but my goal is to give people these skills that they can use to become better communicators. Because as I mentioned, all of us are super communicators. Sometimes we just do it by instinct. Sometimes we're just lucky and it comes out. But if we learn the skills, then we can do it whenever we want. And for the most meaningful conversations, we can really connect with someone else.
Just to follow up on the looping point, I understand you've also got some research associated with the asking of a follow-up question
Yeah,
is another super powerful thing that people dig.
absolutely. Absolutely. And that's actually a form of looping, right? Like sometimes if I ask you a follow-up question, it shows it's proving to you that I was listening to what you were saying. And that's really important.
Certainly. And so then the good follow-up questions do just that. They prove that you were listening to what we were saying, as opposed to, so tell me more about that.
Right.
Which, I mean, is a decent question when you got nothing else. But ideally for a follow-up question, we want to have some content that I could only, I sort of think about it like when I'm getting emails, it's like, was this a mass email sent to the whole world? Or was it sent specifically to me, Pete Mockaitis? And there are little indicators of that in the note. And so too, with the question, one would have to have listened and shared some bits like, you said you think guns are a great way for teachers to prevent violence if they were all armed. Is that right? Yeah, that's what I said. It's like, well, are you aware of some incidences in which folks armed up the teachers and they saw the desired results? And so that there's a follow-up question that shows I was listening.
Yeah. I mean, that's a question where you are presupposing the answer. So I would say one thing that's important is...
Oh, I really was. And I was like, do we have that information? Have we had some school districts where they all toting and then no more troubles?
Oh, okay. Yeah. No, if you're genuinely and curiously asking, that's the key to ask curious questions. But you had said something like the generic question is like, tell me more about that. But again, getting back to deep questions, instead of saying, tell me more about that, an easy way response, if you're not certain what to say, is to say like, what did you make of that? You just told me about this thing. Why was it important to you? And that's a deep question. It doesn't appear deep. It doesn't appear intrusive, or it doesn't appear overly intimate. But again, it's asking me to explain about my values or my beliefs or my experiences. It's giving me a chance to tell you about how I see the world. And I guarantee you that once you hear that, the follow-up questions are going to be almost automatic.
One sponsor to check out is Storyworth. Whenever I'm thinking about meaningful Father's Day gifts, Storyworth leaps to mind. Storyworth helps you preserve precious memories and stories from your father for years to come. Each week, Storyworth emails your loved ones a thought-provoking question that you get to help pick, such as, what's the bravest thing you've ever done? I personally love the prompt so much that I have refreshed Storyworth's questions page many times looking for more. Storyworth makes the writing process super quick and easy. All your loved one needs to do is respond to that email with a story, and then you get a quick copy of that. And after a year of this fun, Storyworth compiles your loved one's stories and photos into a beautiful keepsake hardcover book that you'll be able to share and revisit for generations to come. Families love Storyworth so much, they've got 25,000 five-star reviews on Trustpilot and have millions of stories preserved. So give all the fathers in your life a unique, heartfelt gift they'll all cherish for years. Storyworth. Right now, you can save $10 on your first purchase when you go to storyworth.com/awesome. That's storyworth.com/awesome to save $10 on your first purchase. One sponsor to check out is Harvard Business Review. This brilliant magazine, published at hbr.org, is the leading destination for smart management thinking. Fun fact, HBR has been mentioned in 108 episodes of the show. That's because HBR has great stuff that comes up often. They've got explainer videos, podcasts, real-world case studies, and much more. I think of HBR each night that I put on my special orange glasses. Their article, Will Blue Light Glasses Improve Your Sleep?, revealed that those who wore them reported better sleep and a 7% improvement in work performance as compared to those who wore the sham glasses. So I cite HBR anytime anyone tells me that I look silly wearing them. Now, much of HBR's content is available for free when you sign up at their site. Subscriptions that get you unlimited content cost $10 a month. If you visit hbr.org/subscriptions and enter the promo code AWESOME, you can save 10% off of that subscription. Again, to save 10% off of your HBR subscription, go to www.hbr.org/subscriptions and enter the promo code AWESOME. And big thanks to our sponsor, Acorns. Acorns makes it easy to start automatically saving and investing for your future. You don't need a lot of money or expertise to invest with Acorns. In fact, you can get started with just your spare change. Acorns recommends an expert-built portfolio that fits you and your money goals, then automatically invests your money for you. NerdWallet.com, whom I love on these sorts of matters, gives Acorns a whopping 4.7 stars and says, quote, if you want to make the most of your spare change, there's no better place to do that than Acorns. Head to acorns.com/awesome acorns.com/awesome or download the Acorns app to start saving and investing for your future today. And we got a legal disclaimer here. It may not be representative of all clients. Tier 1 compensation provided. Compensation provides an incentive to positively promote Acorns. View important disclosures at acorns.com/awesome. Investing involves risk, including the loss of principal. Please consider your objectives, risk tolerance, and Acorns' fees before investing. Acorns Advisors LLC, Acorns, is an SEC-registered investment advisor. Brokerage services are provided to clients of Acorns by Acorns Securities LLC, member FINRA/SIPC. For more information, visit acorns.com. All right. Well, now let's hear about some of your favorite things. Can you tell us about a favorite quote, something you find inspiring?
I think the quote that I use most with my kids is, "It's only a mistake if you don't learn something from it." And I realize this is kind of a cheesy quote, but honestly, I make mistakes all the time. We all make mistakes all the time. And it's so easy to get down on yourself that if you tell yourself it's only a mistake if I don't learn from it, then it stops being a mistake. It starts being an experiment. And not all experiments are supposed to go right.
Okay. And a favorite study or experiment or bit of research?
I mentioned this 36 questions. This is an awesome study. So what they did, it's these two researchers at the University of Rhode Island. They took all these people in pairs and they put them in a room, total strangers. And they would have them ask these 36 questions back and forth. And they designed the questions to be deep questions without appearing, many of them didn't appear very deep, particularly at first. And then they send everyone home. It only takes an hour. They send everyone home. This is pre-internet, by the way. And then 7 weeks later, they tracked down everyone who'd been in that study and they asked them one question. Did you ever seek out the person that you had that conversation with? Now, they had not given them any information on how to find each other, right? There was no exchange of business cards or anything like that. So finding the person you had the conversation with was actually kind of hard. They found that 70% of people who had engaged in those conversations had sought out their conversational partner. They would go out to beers and movies together. 3 people ended up getting married to the person that they had the conversation with. And it's because of this emotional reciprocity. It's because if we ask deep questions and then we answer them, we feel close to the other person. And so I just think it's a wonderful study.
It is. I actually went through that list of questions on a date.
Oh, yeah?
We didn't end up getting married.
Yeah, it's okay.
But in a way, it was a good outcome. And then I think I don't know how much that exercise contributed to things, but I think we parted on good terms not too long thereafter. And I guess we knew some new things.
Yeah.
And a favorite book?
I used to always say The Varieties of Religious Experience by William James, which is just one of my favorite books. And it's, for anyone who hasn't read it, there's a chapter on the religion of happy-mindedness. William James, of course, is the father of American psychology. And the religion of happy-mindedness is about people who are just happy. Why are they happy and what do they know that we don't? But the other book that I love that I'll make a plug for, it's actually a novel. It's by Jennifer Egan, and it's called A Visit from the Goon Squad. And very similarly, I think it's about how we create happiness in life and how we recognize it and sometimes fail to recognize it even when it's right in front of us. So it's a wonderful book.
Okay, thank you. And a favorite tool, something you use to be awesome at your job.
Ooh. So I just read an article about AI for the New Yorker, and part of it's about Microsoft's copilots that are coming out. And so I've been using all the different AI products. And I will say, I don't think that it's making me more productive. It's just super fun though, right? I sent out an email this morning and I made an image on Midjourney for it. So I would say right now, AI is the tool that I'm enjoying very much.
Well, so lay it on us. ChatGPT, Midjourney. What else is cool and interesting?
Oh, the copilots. There's going to be an explosion of copilots over the next couple of years. And Microsoft is releasing them right now, but every company is going to be creating agents or copilots. I mean, in 3 or 4 years, this is totally feasible. We will wear a device that records every single conversation. And that conversation will be digitized. It'll be all our data. No one else will have it, right? And then 10 years from now, you'll be like, I was once doing a podcast and this guy talked about AI and I can't remember who he was, but he mentioned Midjourney. Go find that conversation. And the AI will be able to find it. That's what large language models index and search very, very efficiently with even vague guidance. And so if you think about it, our conversations are a huge corpus of knowledge. It's a huge database. And it basically only exists between 2 people, or if you happen to be recording it, it exists between 2 people and whoever's listening to the conversation, but it's hard to remember and you don't know exactly who said what. And once we're able to unlock the database of conversations, it's going to be awesome.
Okay. And you are a habit master. Tell us your favorite habit.
Oh, so in The Power of Habit, there's this whole thing about keystone habits, which are habits that set off chain reactions of other behavior changes. So for me, I would say my keystone habit is definitely exercising in the morning. I really dislike exercising. So what I do is I sign up for half marathons. And by the way, I hate races. There's nothing I enjoy about it. But I sign up for half marathons because I'm so scared about how bad it will hurt to run that half marathon if I haven't trained. And that gets me to go train every morning. And then after I train, I'm like, oh man, I feel great. This is really good. So I would say my big keystone habit is trying to exercise at least once each day.
All right. And is there a key nugget you share that really seems to connect and resonate with folks? They quote it back to you often?
I mean, as I've been working on supercommunicators, the story with my wife, I think, is something that really resonates with people, because I think we've all experienced that, right? Like someone comes to us with a problem and we try and solve it for them. And then they're frustrated, and then we're frustrated. And so I find that explaining it's actually two different kinds of conversations are happening here, that's been really powerful for a lot of people.
Okay. And if folks want to learn more or get in touch, where would you point them?
If you Google me, I'm at charlesduhigg.com. If you just type supercommunicators into your Google browser, I'll probably come up, or Power of Habit. And then my email address is charles@duhigg.com. And I read every single email I get from listeners and from readers, and I respond to every single one. So feel free to drop me a note and I will definitely respond to you.
Okay. And do you have a final challenge or call to action for folks looking to be awesome at their jobs?
Here's the thing that I would say is think about your job right now and think about where you're not communicating as well as you can. Maybe it's with a coworker, maybe it's with your boss, maybe it's with a client, maybe it's when you're doing pitches. There is some time in your life where you wish that you could be an effortless super communicator, and it's not happening on a consistent basis for you. And my guess is, as a result, you're shying away from that opportunity because you're worried that it's not going to go as well as you want it to go. So just break it down. Try and think about the last conversation you had where it didn't go as well as you wanted it to go, and try and figure out, were we having the same kind of conversation? Was I asking enough questions? Was I asking the right kinds of questions? Was I proving to this person that I was listening to them? Were they responding to me and inviting me to match them? If you do that, you'll find that there's this part of your work life that you probably don't like as much as you should, but it is an absolutely solvable problem. Nobody is born a great communicator. It's just a set of skills that anyone can learn.
All right, Charles, thank you. I wish you much luck in super communications.
Thank you so much.
I really love Charles's perspective on asking deep questions. So after we've gotten to, so what do you do? And they say something like, oh, I'm an accountant. A lot of times it's just like, cool. But so much better would be like, oh, have you always wanted to be an accountant? What do you like about accounting? And then I think sometimes we might be a little bit sheepish or nervous, like, oh, what if they don't like accounting? What if the worst case scenario pops up and they say, nothing, I hate accounting. Well, that's actually deepening right there too. It's like, oh, are you looking to make a shift, or what leads you to stick around? And I think that's really cool. Or you could discover some really fun perspectives, like, oh, accounting doesn't sound fun to me. I wonder what this guy likes about accounting. And then that person tells you, well, it's actually super satisfying to see what starts out as a complicated mess all neatly tick and tie together with debits, matching credits. It kind of reminds me of organizing a really messy closet and then beholding the beauty of everything all together, just in the right places, knowing that the stress and anxiety my client was experiencing going into tax time is now a relief, and you could see it in their faces. I don't know. You could get the idea how something that starts off pretty surface level can get into really cool, connecting, memorable territory pretty quickly if we summon just a smidge of courage to ask some of these deeper questions. Powerful stuff from Charles. If you want to get a summary write-up of this conversation, as well as subsequent conversations summarized in an email in your inbox, you can sign up for the Gold Nuggets at awesomeatyourjob.com. That will also unlock the whole vault or archive of these 937 such summary write-ups. Those are called the Gold Nuggets at awesomeatyourjob.com. And if you want to check out the particular transcript and notes for this episode, that is over at awesomeatyourjob.com/EP937. Hope to catch you next time, and peace.
Thanks for listening. To get the most out of the show, we recommend 2 key things. First, check out the extra resources at awesomeatyourjob.com. You can find this episode's transcript and links, as well as the perfect episode for your situation. You can search the full-text transcripts of hundreds of episodes or explore episodes tagged by topic and competency covered. Second, subscribe to the podcast and get future episodes automatically. You can subscribe by telling Siri and several other smartphones and speakers, subscribe to the How to Be Awesome at Your Job podcast, or by tapping subscribe in your podcast player of choice. If you'd like some extra help figuring out podcasts and how subscriptions work, visit awesomeatyourjob.com/subscribe for guidance. Hope to catch you on the next episode of How to Be Awesome at Your Job.